the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru. Today we're looking at another RTX card. This one is actually a 2070 from Zotac, but as you can see it's a little bit different. It's actually one of their mini cards, so it measures only 211mm long. With a factory overclock core as well, the question we're really asking today is, can this 2070 compete with the big boys of the division? We've already seen some from Palette, we've seen some from MSI that come in, big cards, factory overclock cores, so how can this Zotac mini card compete? Well, we're going to start with a look at the design, and obviously the first thing we really do have to talk about are the dimensions of this card. It actually measures 211mm by 129mm by 41mm, so it is a very, very tiny card. I've actually compared it here to the Palette RTX 2070 Game Rock Premium. I reviewed that probably a couple of weeks ago, and that is a monster of a card. So considering that Zotac has managed to shrink down a 2070, it's smaller in every dimension than that Palette. I think it's really impressive actually, though we're going to have to see what the performance as well as the thermals and noise testing is like later on in the review. In terms of the size, this card obviously isn't going to be the kind of thing you're going to buy and stick in your standard mid-tower chassis, but if you do want to build maybe a high-power HTPC for the living room, or you're building an ITX rig to take to LAN events for instance, this 2070 could be just the thing, at least in terms of its size. Now, in terms of the shroud, it is mostly gunmetal grey and black. It is made from plastic though, and it definitely doesn't feel the most premium. When you pick it up, you can really feel the plastic kind of move and flex in your hand. Obviously, once it's installed in your case, it's not going to really make much of a difference, but definitely when you do pick it up and hold it in the hand, you can feel that plastic kind of moving and flexing. If we look at the two fans on the front of the shroud though, these are actually quite interesting, as not only are they both different sizes, they also have different fan blade designs as well. So as we're looking at it now, the fan on the left actually measures 90mm and has a kind of more swept fan blade design, whereas the fan on the right actually measures 100mm, whereas the blade design is much straighter and flatter. We did ask Zotac about this, and at the time of filming we are still waiting for an official response, but once we hear back from them I will make sure to include that in the written review over on kitguru.net. But if I had to take an educated guess, I would say that the different fan sizes as well as the different fan blade designs, it's designed to give slightly different static pressure levels to aid cooling of the GPU, the VRAM chips, as well as the VRM, as obviously they're in different positions over the board, and potentially as well the two different designs might help decrease air turbulence. We do also have to touch on the LED lighting of the card. Of course, it wouldn't be a graphics card review without a look at the lighting, and interestingly Zotac's gone with, there's 3 different zones of lighting on the card. You've got these 2 kind of V shapes on the front of the card, as well as the Zotac logo on the side of the card. But interestingly, these aren't actually RGB, it's a white only light, so depending on your views of RGB, you might either love or hate this. Personally, I don't mind. I think the white looks quite clean, but it is just worth mentioning it's a static white only light, so if you do love RGB, this potentially won't be the card for you. On that front side of the card as well, obviously that Zotac logo as we mentioned, but just to the right of that we can see there is also the GeForce RTX branding. But what I actually think is quite interesting is how the backplate kind of bends over, it kind of meets the plastic shroud, so it gives this kind of wraparound look, which isn't something we usually see from other graphics cards. The rest of the backplate is made from black metal. You can see there is a little cutout behind the GPU core. The large Zotac logo, which I think looks like some kind of mask or face perhaps, let me know in the comments if you have a better idea of what it is. That takes up the right hand side of the case, and you can also see the words "Live to Game" on the left hand side of the card as well. Now, other things to mention in terms of the card's design, it's actually only a single 8-pin PCIe power connector. We'll look at power draw later on in the review as well. And in terms of display I/O, this is actually the first RTX card I've seen that does not have one of those new USB-C ports. Instead, we've got 3 display ports, 1 HDMI and 1 DVI-D. Now, moving on to take a look at the internals of the card, you only need to remove 6 screws from the back of the card to get into the PCB. And interestingly, the first thing I actually noted was the fact that despite the card only measuring 211mm long, the actual PCB itself is about 2.5 centimeters shorter than that, whereas the rest of the space is taken up by the heatsink as well as part of the backplate. In terms of the PCB design itself though, Zotac has stuck with the 6+2 power phases. That's the same as we saw on Nvidia's 2070 Founders Edition, and we can also see that there are 8GB of GDDR6 memory, which again comes from Micron. The GPU is also labelled TU106-400A, and as we know, the A signifies that this is a bin chip suitable to be sold with a factory overclock. This card is actually only clocked at 1650 MHz, so it's only 30 MHz faster than reference speeds, but nonetheless it is still a factory overclock, therefore it does need one of these binned A chips. Moving on now to look at the heatsink. This is obviously quite a small unit, it's quite thin, it's not very long either. It does still manage to incorporate 5 heat pipes though, each of which look like they measure 6mm in diameter. We can also see that there is a dedicated cold plate for the VRAM chips, and also the MOSFETs as well have their own cold plate as well. The GPU die itself contacts with this little copper cold plate, and again we can see all the necessary thermal pads for both the VRAM chips as well as the MOSFETs. Right now, moving on to performance, it's worth saying we're going to show you 1440p benchmarks here, which I think is the sweet spot for the 2070, although of course if you are interested in 1080p and 4K benchmarks, as well as our full testing methodology, you can head over to kitguru.net. So then, starting with 3D Mark Timespy and then moving into our real world suite of games, it's actually quite easy to summarize the performance of this Zotac Mini 2070. It is generally, of course, in the ballpark of the 2070 cards. You know, the difference between all the cards isn't going to be massive, but generally speaking, this Zotac card does come behind the others. It's kind of at the bottom of the pile. So if we look, comparing it to the MSI Armor 8G, it is on average about 2% slower across all the games we tested at 1440p. So while certainly the margin is not big, it's not very far behind at all compared to the other 2070s, and for me, the 1440p frame rates are very, very good. This still does have to go down as the slowest 2070 we have tested to date. For those interested in Battlefield 5, of course now with ray tracing, we did test this card firstly with both DXR off, and then again with DXR set to Ultra, and we'll show you the 1080p and 1440p results here as well, although of course 4K again on kitguru.net. So even with Battlefield 5, the general trend does of course continue. We do see the Zotac fall a little bit behind the Palette RTX 2070 Game Rock Premium, although that being said, the frame rates are still very solid, and for me, even at 1440p with DXR set to Ultra, this Zotac Mini is still producing very playable frame rates. All this testing as well was done with the latest Battlefield 5 patch, so that's brought a hefty performance increase to the ray tracing features. We did a proper dedicated look at that as well, so you can find that on kitguru.net as well if you are interested. Moving on now to look at average clock speed under load, we can here see the reason why this Zotac card was kind of performing slightly behind the rest of the 2070s. Its average clock speed, despite the factory overclock, was 1744 MHz, so that was about 10 MHz slower than the MSI Armor 8G. We can also see the likes of MSI's Gaming Z 2070 and the Palette Game Rock Premium 2070, both of those cards running at over 1900 MHz, which again helps to explain the reason why this Zotac was performing slightly slower than the other 2070s we have already tested. Thermal performance though was actually really impressive for this Zotac Mini. The GPU core only peaked at 63 degrees, which is during our Firestrike Ultra stress test. We looped that for 20 runs, and the card only peaked at 63C, which as you can see on the chart here, is actually one of the lowest results to date. Those thermal results we've seen are obviously linked to acoustics as well, and here we can see this Zotac Mini is a little bit louder than some of the other aftermarket RTX cards we have already reviewed. I definitely wouldn't class it as a loud card, it peaks at just over 42 decibels, so it's by no means a really aggressive, really loud card. But then again, if we do compare it to some of the other aftermarket cards we've seen recently, those barely produce more than 40 decibels, and a 2 decibel gap doesn't sound like much on paper, but you can definitely tell the difference, so this card is slightly louder and you can notice the difference. For me though, I still think actually it's a very good result. We really do have to remember this is a very small card. Some of those other cards we've tested are massive, triple slot, 3-fan solutions. So for Zotac to make a card like this, still only peaking over 42 decibels, I think overall they have done a very good job. The other area to look at now is power consumption, and just a reminder, we do have dedicated sensors in both the PCIe slot as well as the PCI power connectors, and that lets us measure the power draw for the graphics card only, not the system as a whole. So for this Zotac card, it averaged just over 170 watts under load, which does actually make it the kind of the least power hungry RTX 2070 card we have reviewed so far, although again, if we factor in the fact that it's also the slowest, that is probably to be expected. Still though, just over 170 watts actually makes this perfect for someone, maybe you've got a 450 watt SFX unit, in an ITX rig for instance, this should be absolutely no problem at all to power from a PSU like that. In terms of a manual overclock as well, this card probably did better than I was expecting. I managed to add an extra 125 MHz to the GPU core and an extra 700 MHz to the memory. This actually brought our average clock speed under load up to almost 1900 MHz, so that was a pretty sizable increase actually compared to the out-of-the-box results, and accordingly we saw an extra 4 FPS while playing Deus Ex Mankind Divided, and an extra 7 FPS when playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with both of those results coming at 1440p. Thermals did jump up to 67 degrees, which still I think is a pretty impressive result considering the size of the card, and then again noise levels did jump up by just over a decibel, so bringing the total output to almost 44 decibels from this Zotac Mini. So overall I would actually say the Zotac Mini handled this overclock very well, again considering its diminutive size and the fact it was running 8% faster than its out-of-the-box frequency. So then wrapping up this review, on the whole I have to say I'm really impressed with the Zotac RTX 2070 Mini. It's managed to take a 2070, shrink it down into a package which is only 211mm long and has done so without doing any major compromises. Yes, it is slightly slower than other 2070s we've already seen, and yes, it is slightly louder, but those are by no means catastrophic results. Considering this card is as small as it is, I really think Zotac has done an all-round solid job with this Mini 2070, so anyone considering building a compact but relatively quite powerful system, this 2070 card will do the job very nicely. The one thing I would say is that if you are looking for a 2070 that's kind of been downsized into a package this small, Zotac actually has two different models. The first is the OC edition, which I've actually reviewed here today, and that has a 1650 MHz boost clock, whereas the exact same card is actually also available with a 1620 MHz boost clock, which is reference speeds. The price difference as well between the two is £80, so the OC model actually costs £80 more than the reference clock model, and again, like I said, that's only a 30 MHz difference. So if it were me, if I were buying a card like this, I definitely would go for the reference clock Mini 2070. Not only will you be able to make up that 30 MHz gap between the two, you'll be able to actually make up even further than that via manual overclocking, and you'll save yourself £80 in the process. Still, this is a all-round very capable 2070 in a compact and tidy form factor. If it were me, I wouldn't pay the extra £80 for the OC edition, but Zotac has still definitely impressed me with generally how good this actually 2070 is, considering how small it really is. So I'm Dominic for KitGuru. This has been my review of the Zotac RTX 2070 OC Mini. If you like this review, you can give us a like and leave us a comment below as well. I'll be really interested if any of you are thinking of picking up a mini card, for instance. What would be your planned use case? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you want to stay up to date with all of what KitGuru has to offer in the future, I've got more RTX cards to review. We're also going to have things like gaming laptops, motherboards, CPUs, all that kind of stuff. You can hit that subscribe button as well. Be sure to click that little bell icon as well if you don't want to miss out on any of those future videos. You'll just get a notification through when one of those goes live. So, I've been Dominic for KitGuru. This has been my review of the Zotac RTX 2070 OC Mini, and I will see you in the next video.